Something that biblical scholars know, that the average reader of the Bible might not know, is that there aren't actually 12 tribes of Israel. As iconic as that idea is, the reality on the ground is a bit different. There are anywhere between 10 to 14 tribes of Israel, depending on which passage in the Bible you happen to be looking at. And the disparity between the idealized number of 12 and any of the actual instances of the tribes being numbered attests to exactly what this commenter is getting at right here. A long history of different biblical authors thinking of different ways to relate these disparate groups to one another. Everybody's convinced that they're related in some way, but exactly in what way, in what number, how are they divided up, why have they come together, all these kinds of questions are up to different biblical authors to answer in different ways. And this isn't something biblical scholars are just making up for funsies. This is something you see in biblical texts, particularly in places where you get genealogies of the different tribes, or when the different tribes have to interact as actual tribal units, or anytime you try to map out the tribes according to their traditional land allotments that are given in places like the book of Joshua, you see that the actual number of tribes fluctuates a little bit. I think if you were to ask a lot of people, they would say that there are 2 southern tribes and then 10 northern tribes. But as soon as you look at a map, you see that's not really the case. The map isn't matching the idea. When you look at the map, you'll see that there are 3 southern tribes. There are 7 northern tribes. There are 3 tribes east of the Jordan River, and there's 1 more tribe that isn't mapped at all. That's 14, not 12. Our 3 southern tribes are Judah, Benjamin, and then Simeon. And Simeon often gets forgotten for social political reasons because its tribal territory is almost entirely encompassed by Judah, which is the much more prominent and powerful tribe. And a similar sort of situation happens with Benjamin, due in no small part to the fact that Jerusalem is right there, and Jerusalem is the capital of the kingdom of Judah. And then our northern tribes are Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and then eventually the tribe of Dan migrates way up north. Those are our 7 northern tribes. And then we have 3 tribes east of the Jordan River, Manasseh again, and then we also have Reuben and Gad. Now, Manasseh really deserves to be counted twice. It is both a northern tribe, one of the most prominent northern tribes, but also a tribe east of the Jordan River. And there are several instances in biblical narrative where this is treated as a second tribe. One is in the book of Joshua, where not only does a combined vanguard of the eastern half of Manasseh, and then also Reuben and Gad, function as sort of an elite military unit in the conquest of the land of Canaan. But then also at the conclusion of the book of Joshua, in a story that we often forget, there's nearly a civil war between the western tribes and the eastern tribes over this idea of like cultic identity and who are these people on the east anyway. They can't come over here to worship, and worshiping over here is so definitive of Israelite identity, so who are they over there, right? This text preserves a lot of these ethnic anxieties. And so that would involve necessarily Manasseh sort of going to war with itself, which doesn't make much sense unless you treat them as 2 separate tribes. They're also treated as 2 separate tribes in the genealogies in the opening chapters of Chronicles. Manasseh is listed twice with 2 very different sets of descriptions attached to it, one for the western half and one for the eastern half. And this just matches, again, sort of the social political realities on the ground. The western half of the tribe of Manasseh is one of the most prominent tribes in the entire coalition. It has some of the most important and most powerful, wealthiest cities in northern Israel. And then the eastern half is in a very different situation, having none of that prominence and spending most of its history like being, if not outright attacked, then hanging over it the shadow of Aram Damascus at all times. So the geographic difference between the 2 tribes creates a very different social and thereby ethnic difference over a long enough period of time. And then, of course, we have the tribe of Levi, who isn't given a traditional land allotment, but is instead given a variety of cities dispersed throughout the region. And this probably attests to a very early tradition in which the Levites were cultic functionaries at a variety of worship sites all throughout the area, which was then later sort of reinterpreted once the ideology of the centralization of worship became much more prominent among the elite classes in ancient Israel and Judah. Once that idea settled in, we only worship at one place. That one place is a temple in Jerusalem, then having the Levites dispersed throughout the entirety of the country made very little sense. But we get different numbers of tribal configurations in different places in the Hebrew Bible. So one example of this is in 1 Kings chapter 11, in a story where Jeroboam, who's going to be king of northern Israel, meets with the prophet Ahijah. And Ahijah does this dramatic, symbolic action like prophets often do and tears his cloak into a bunch of pieces. And he hands 10 of these pieces to Jeroboam, implying that he's going to have dominion over 10 tribes eventually, and then keeps one piece for the sake of David in the south. Well, 10 plus 1 is not 12. 10 plus 1 is 11. So this preserves a different configuration of the tribes where there are 10 northern tribes and only one southern tribe. And since that one southern tribe has got to be Judah, this imagines that there are 10 other tribes in the north. But this would also be, combining Manasseh and probably leaving out Levi and a bunch of other things that are happening sort of behind the scenes of the text. Another instance where we get a different number of tribes is in Judges chapter 5 in the Song of Deborah. In this story, we get an alliance of tribes that come to help Deborah fight against the Canaanites. And there are 8 tribes that are named in this passage. One is Reuben, one of the Transjordanian tribes. And then 6 of the other tribes named are all northern tribes geographically, all up in the northern, what's going to become northern Israel. All of them are named except for Manasseh. Manasseh's left off for some reason. And then one southern tribe, Benjamin, is mentioned. But then none of the other tribes are mentioned. Levi is not mentioned. Simeon is not mentioned. Judah is not mentioned. As if they don't exist, or as if their participation in this significant, sort of culturally foundational event is not worth considering. And that, too, probably attests to a very early tradition where there are some tribes in the land, but the exact relationship between those tribes that are mentioned and other tribes that will come to be associated with Israel, that connection hasn't been made yet. I really wish I had an easy recommendation to give to lay audiences of a scholarly level book that looks at the way that the tribes of Israel have been configured differently over time. Unfortunately, I do not. I'm sorry. My favorite book on this subject is The Tribes of Yahweh by Norman Gottwald, which is one of the sort of iconic applications of the social sciences and a Marxist perspective to the history and the formation of ancient Israel. Unfortunately, that book, although not super complex, is about 1,000 pages long, so it makes it a little bit difficult to recommend to people. But if you have the endurance for it, I would certainly recommend it. It's an amazing book that offers a hypothesis about how all these disparate groups and under what conditions all these disparate groups came together to think of themselves as tribal units within this collectivity that is ancient Israel.